Welcome to our deep dive into the fascinating world of New York City architecture. We've got some fascinating excerpts from an architectural overview and a collection of images that'll make this a visual journey as well. Today, we're going to explore those iconic skyscrapers, those charming brownstones, and uncover the stories behind those famous skylines. Ready to unlock the secrets of NYC architecture?
Absolutely, and I think you'll be amazed by the contrasting architectural identities we'll uncover. We'll see the towering ambition of skyscrapers and the historical whispers of residential districts. It's this duality that makes NYC architecture so compelling.
Let's start with those skyscrapers then. I mean, we've all seen those stunning skylines, especially in Midtown and Lower Manhattan. It's like a forest of giants reaching for the sky.
It's truly a sight to behold. New York City boasts one of the most diverse collections of skyscrapers anywhere in the world. And when you compare pictures of Lower Manhattan before and after 9/11, you see a stark difference. The skyline we know today, with One World Trade Center dominating the view, really highlights the city's ability to rebuild and redefine itself.
Speaking of rebuilding, how did those early skyscrapers even come about? Was there like a specific event that triggered this vertical ambition?
It's fascinating, actually. Back in the early 20th century, there was this sense of limitless possibility, a drive to build higher and higher. But this unfettered growth led to some real challenges. Streets were becoming dark and crowded, and there were concerns about air circulation and fire safety. It became clear that some sort of control was needed.
So how did the city address this sort of architectural free-for-all?
That's where the 1916 zoning resolution comes in. This groundbreaking regulation literally reshaped the New York City skyline. Take a look at this diagram. Before 1916, buildings could rise straight up, blocking out light and air. But this resolution introduced the concept of setbacks. Imagine you're stacking building blocks, and as you go higher, you have to step the blocks back, creating a tapered shape.
Ah, so that explains why so many of those iconic skyscrapers have those distinct setbacks and those beautiful tapered tops.
Exactly. This regulation wasn't just about practicality, it also fueled architectural creativity. Buildings like the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, with their iconic Art Deco designs, wouldn't exist without those setback rules. And speaking of the Chrysler Building, it's amazing to think that it was part of a fierce competition in the 1920s to build the world's tallest building. The ambition of that era was palpable.
It was a race to the top, literally. And for a while, the Chrysler Building held that coveted title, becoming the first building in the world to break the 1,000-foot barrier. Imagine the engineering challenges they must have overcome back then. What were some of the technological advancements that made such a feat possible?
Well, the development of high-strength steel was crucial. It allowed architects to create lighter and taller structures without compromising stability. And the invention of the elevator, of course, made these towering heights practical for everyday use. But beyond the technical aspects, there was a shift in architectural thinking. The Art Deco style, with its emphasis on geometric forms, sleek lines, and luxurious materials, perfectly captured the spirit of progress and modernity.
And it's not just the materials and technology that are fascinating, it's the stories behind these buildings. Like the Chrysler Building spire was actually assembled secretly inside the building and then hoisted to the top in the dramatic last-minute move to win that height race. It's like something out of a movie.
It really is. And that competitive spirit, that drive to push boundaries, is what makes New York City architecture so captivating. But let's not forget, there's more to NYC architecture than just skyscrapers.
You're right. Those beautiful brownstone neighborhoods, the townhouses, those are just as much a part of the city's fabric as the skyscrapers. They offer a glimpse into the lives of everyday New Yorkers.
Absolutely. And you'll find a surprising variety of architectural styles in the outer boroughs, from Victorian-era homes to charming row houses. Each neighborhood has its own unique architectural personality. It's like a hidden treasure trove waiting to be discovered.
I'm already imagining myself strolling through Brooklyn Heights, admiring those elegant brownstones. By the way, is there a reason they're called brownstones? It seems pretty literal, but is there a story behind that name?
It's actually quite simple. The name comes from the brown sandstone that was commonly used to build these row houses in the 19th century. This particular type of sandstone, quarried primarily in Connecticut and New Jersey, was readily available and relatively affordable.
It's amazing how a building material can become so synonymous with an entire architectural style. And those brownstones weren't just a product of material availability, right? Wasn't there a brownstone boom driven by other factors as well?
You're absolutely right. The brownstone boom was fueled by several factors. Firstly, the city was rapidly expanding in the mid to late 19th century, and there was a growing demand for housing. Then advancements in transportation, like the completion of the Brooklyn Bridge in 1883, made it easier for people to commute from the outer boroughs to Manhattan for work.
The Brooklyn Bridge, such an iconic structure, was a game changer in so many ways. And it's fascinating to think that this bridge, built over 140 years ago, played a direct role in shaping the neighborhoods we see today.
It really did. It opened up new areas for residential development and led to the creation of those charming brownstone neighborhoods that are now so sought after.
But let's be honest, not all of NYC's residential history is as charming as those brownstones.
Hmm.
We have to talk about those tenement buildings, those multi-story apartment buildings that housed so many immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They represent a darker side of the city's housing story, don't they?
You're right, they do. The rapid influx of immigrants to New York City in the late 1800s led to severe overcrowding and deplorable living conditions in many tenement buildings. But it's important to remember that these buildings were also a symbol of resilience and hope for many immigrant families seeking a better life in America.
It's a reminder that architecture is not just about aesthetics, it's about the lives lived within those walls. And thankfully, over time, those tenement buildings gave way to larger apartment buildings and eventually to the residential towers we see dominating the skyline today.
And that evolution in residential architecture reflects the changing needs and aspirations of the city's inhabitants. From the humble tenement buildings to those luxurious high-rise apartments with stunning views, it's a testament to the city's constant adaptation.
It's incredible how you can trace the social and economic history of the city through its architecture. But before we get too lost in the grand narratives, let's talk about some of those quirky details that make NYC architecture so unique. I love those little touches that you might not notice at first glance.
You're in for a treat. First, let's talk about those ubiquitous water towers perched atop buildings all over the city. Have you ever wondered why they're there?
I have. They always struck me as a curious feature. They almost look like little sentinels guarding the city.
They are, but those water towers are more than just a quirky aesthetic. They were a practical necessity. Back in the early days of skyscrapers, modern plumbing systems couldn't handle the water pressure needed to reach those upper floors.
So they're like a charming reminder of a time before technology could solve every problem. I love that. What's the other detail you wanted to share?
This one's about the materials themselves. New York City's buildings are a tapestry of textures and hues, unlike many cities that rely primarily on local stone.
Now that you mention it, I do remember noticing the variety of colors and textures in those buildings. What's the reason for that?
Well, unlike cities built primarily from local stone, New York City sourced its building materials from all over the country. It was a logistical feat, with trains bringing in marble from Vermont and granite from Minnesota.
Wow, it's amazing to think of those trains rumbling into the city loaded with tons of stone, all to build this architectural marvel we see today. And it's that variety of materials that gives the city its unique visual character.
Absolutely. It's like a geological tapestry woven into the very fabric of the city. And that brings us to two more crucial elements of New York City's built environment: bridges and the famous grid system.
All right, let's talk bridges. New York City is a city defined by water. So bridges are its lifelines connecting boroughs and carrying millions of people every day. But they're more than just functional structures, aren't they?
They are indeed. They're feats of engineering and works of art. Think of the Brooklyn Bridge, the Manhattan Bridge, the George Washington Bridge. Each one is an iconic symbol of the city and a testament to human ingenuity.
Those bridges are instantly recognizable, even to people who've never been in New York City. They've become symbols of the city itself.
Hmm.
And it's incredible to think that many of them were record breakers when they were built. The Brooklyn Bridge, for example, was the longest suspension bridge in the world when it opened in 1883.
It was a marvel of its time, and it wasn't just about functionality. The bridge's neo-Gothic towers and intricate cable work made it a beautiful landmark as well. It perfectly embodies that blend of practicality and aesthetics that we see throughout NYC's architecture.
And then there's the grid, that seemingly endless checkerboard of streets and avenues that makes Manhattan so distinctive. It's so iconic, but I have to admit I've gotten lost in that grid more than once.
I think we all have. But there's a reason behind that seemingly rigid structure. It all goes back to the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, a visionary plan that laid out the framework for the city's future development. Look at this satellite image of Manhattan. You can clearly see that grid structure stretching across the island.
It's remarkable how this plan, created over 200 years ago, still shapes the city we know today. Was the grid always universally accepted, though? It does seem a bit well rigid.
You're right, not everyone was a fan of the grid. Frederick Law Olmsted, the famed landscape architect who designed Central Park, found it too rigid and unnatural. He believed in incorporating more organic forms and natural elements into city planning.
That's an interesting perspective. Olmsted's vision for Central Park is so different from the regimented grid of the surrounding streets. It's like a deliberate contrast, a breath of nature amidst the urban geometry. But even with his critics, the grid has undeniably shaped the character of Manhattan.
Absolutely. It's facilitated the city's growth, making it easier to navigate and develop. And within those gridded streets, we see that incredible diversity of architectural styles that makes New York City so visually stimulating. It's a constant dialogue between order and creativity.
It's a fascinating balance, and I think we've just scratched the surface of this architectural adventure. There's so much more to explore. I can't wait to dive deeper into some of those specific styles, those hidden gems, and those stories that make New York City's architecture so captivating.
We'll get ready for part two because we're about to uncover even more fascinating architectural tales and the people behind those amazing structures. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the architectural wonders of New York City. I'm already feeling inspired by all the stories we uncovered in part one, from those ambitious early skyscrapers to the charming brownstones that line the streets.
It's amazing how each building, each bridge, even each street corner has a story to tell. And as we delve deeper into this exploration, you'll start to see how those individual stories intertwine to create the grand narrative of New York City's architectural evolution.
You know, one thing that really struck me in part one was the sheer variety of architectural styles we see in New York City. It's like a living timeline of architectural history with Gothic Revival art, Deco Beaux-Arts, and so many other styles all coexisting in this urban landscape.
It's a true melting pot of architectural influences, and that diversity is a direct reflection of the city's history as a global hub. Think about it, New York City has always been a magnet for immigrants and ideas from all over the world.
So each wave of newcomers brought their own architectural traditions and tastes, adding to this incredible tapestry of styles.
That's fascinating. It's like the city's architecture is a visual representation of its cultural diversity.
Exactly. And you can see this reflected in everything from the grand apartment buildings of the Upper West Side with their European-inspired facades to the row houses of Brooklyn, each neighborhood showcasing a unique blend of architectural influences.
It's amazing how those architectural details can transport you to another time and place. Speaking of transporting ourselves, we can't forget about those iconic bridges that connect the different parts of the city. They're not just functional structures, they're architectural marvels that have become symbols of New York City itself.
Absolutely. The bridges of New York City are testaments to the city's ambition and engineering ingenuity. And many of them were record breakers when they were built, pushing the boundaries of what was possible at the time. Like the Brooklyn Bridge, which we touched on earlier. When it opened in 1883, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. It's incredible to think about the engineering challenges they must have faced back then.
Imagine constructing a bridge of that scale in the late 19th century. It was a monumental task requiring innovative engineering techniques and a workforce of thousands. And beyond the engineering feat, the Brooklyn Bridge is also a beautiful structure.
Those neo-Gothic towers and the delicate web of cables create such a striking visual. It's like a work of art that also happens to be a functional bridge.
It's that combination of artistry and engineering that makes the Brooklyn Bridge so iconic. And then you have other remarkable bridges, each with its own unique design and story.
Like the Manhattan Bridge with its graceful arch, or the Queensboro Bridge with its distinctive cantilever design. And of course the George Washington Bridge, spanning the Hudson River with its massive steel cables.
Each bridge represents a different era of engineering and architectural innovation, but they all share that common thread of connecting the city both physically and symbolically.
They're like threads woven into the urban fabric, creating a sense of unity and continuity.
And speaking of connections, we can't overlook the most defining characteristic of Manhattan's urban landscape, the street grid. That seemingly endless checkerboard of streets and avenues has become synonymous with New York City itself.
It's so iconic. But let's be honest, navigating that grid can be a challenge even for seasoned New Yorkers. It's like a giant puzzle with streets running east-west and avenues running north-south.
It's definitely a system that requires some getting used to, but there's a fascinating history behind its creation. It all goes back to the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, a visionary document that essentially laid out the blueprint for Manhattan's future development.
It was a bold plan, especially considering that Manhattan was still largely undeveloped at the time.
Yeah.
What was the rationale behind imposing this grid structure on the island?
The commissioners were driven by a desire for order and efficiency. They envisioned a city that would be easy to navigate with streets laid out in a predictable pattern. And they believed that a grid system would facilitate the city's growth, allowing for organized development and efficient land division.
So it was about practicality, creating a framework for a city that was destined to expand rapidly. It's amazing to think that this plan, conceived over 200 years ago, still shapes the way we experience Manhattan today.
It's a testament to the enduring impact of urban planning. And while the grid has undeniably facilitated the city's growth, it wasn't without its critics. Remember Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, whom we mentioned earlier?
Oh, right. He was a proponent of incorporating more natural elements into urban design.
Exactly. Olmsted found the grid system too rigid and unnatural. He believed that cities should embrace organic forms and create spaces that foster a sense of connection with nature.
It's interesting to contrast Olmsted's vision for Central Park with its winding paths and naturalistic landscapes with the regimented grid that surrounds it. It's like a deliberate juxtaposition, a reminder that even within a highly structured urban environment, there's room for nature and organic beauty.
It's a beautiful tension, isn't it? And it speaks to the ongoing dialogue between order and creativity in urban design. But even within the constraints of the grid, you see incredible architectural diversity and innovation.
That's what I find so fascinating about New York City's architecture. You have this underlying structure, this framework of the grid, but within that framework, there's this explosion of creativity and self-expression. You have sleek glass towers rising next to ornate Beaux-Arts buildings, all lining those perfectly straight avenues.
It's like a visual symphony with different architectural styles harmonizing to create this vibrant urban landscape. And that juxtaposition, that constant dialogue between different periods and styles, is what makes walking through New York City such a visually stimulating experience.
It's like a never-ending architectural treasure hunt, with something new to discover around every corner. And it's not just about the individual buildings, it's about how they relate to each other, how they create a sense of place and identity.
Exactly. And that brings us to the question of how this architectural tapestry continues to evolve. What are some of the trends and challenges shaping the future of New York City's architecture?
That's a great question. What's on the horizon for this ever-evolving city? What new architectural stories are waiting to be written?
One of the most significant trends we're seeing is the increasing emphasis on sustainability and environmental consciousness. Architects are no longer just focused on aesthetics and functionality, they're also considering the environmental impact of their designs.
That makes sense. In a city as dense and bustling as New York, sustainability has to be a top priority. Are there any specific examples of this trend in action? Are there buildings that showcase this new wave of sustainable architecture?
Absolutely. A prime example is the Hearst Tower completed in 2006. It was the first skyscraper in New York City to receive the Gold LED certification, a prestigious recognition of its environmentally friendly design.
Wow, the first skyscraper in New York City to achieve that level of sustainability. That's quite a milestone. What are some of the design elements that make the Hearst Tower so eco-friendly?
Well, for starters, the building incorporates a diagrid structure, which uses less steel than traditional construction methods. And it's clad in a high-performance glass curtain wall that maximizes natural light while minimizing heat gain. The tower also features rainwater collection systems, energy-efficient lighting, and advanced air filtration systems.
It sounds like they really thought of everything. It's a great example of how innovative design can go hand in hand with environmental responsibility. And this trend toward sustainability isn't just limited to new construction, is it?
You're right, there's also a growing movement to adapt and retrofit older buildings to make them more energy efficient.
That's a great way to preserve the city's architectural heritage, while also reducing its environmental footprint. It's like giving those older buildings a new lease on life, both literally and figuratively.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between preserving the past and embracing the future. And this approach is not just about environmental benefits, it also makes economic sense. Retrofitting older buildings can reduce energy costs and enhance property values.
It's a win-win situation.
Mm.
And as we consider the future of New York City's architecture, sustainability is certainly a key theme. But are there other challenges that architects are grappling with in this ever-evolving urban landscape? I imagine space constraints are a major issue in a city as densely populated as New York.
You're absolutely right. Space is a precious commodity in New York City, especially in Manhattan. Finding suitable locations for new development is a constant challenge.
So how are architects responding to this challenge? Are they coming up with innovative ways to maximize space and create buildings that fit into this dense urban fabric?
They are. One trend we're seeing is vertical expansion. Buildings are getting taller and slimmer, reaching new heights to maximize the limited ground space available.
It's like the city is reaching for the sky, not just out of ambition, but out of necessity as well. It's fascinating to see how constraints can actually drive innovation and lead to those iconic slender skyscrapers that now define the New York City skyline.
And beyond simply building taller, architects are also exploring ways to reclaim underutilized spaces. Former industrial areas, waterfront properties, even spaces above existing structures are being transformed into vibrant new developments.
It's like the city is constantly reinventing itself, finding creative ways to adapt to its evolving needs and constraints. And that spirit of adaptation and innovation is reflected in its architecture.
It's a never-ending process of evolution. But beyond the practical challenges of space and sustainability, there are also aesthetic and philosophical questions that shape the future of NYC architecture.
Oh, like what? What kinds of questions are architects pondering as they envision the buildings of tomorrow?
Well, there's the ongoing quest to design buildings that are not only functional and sustainable, but also aesthetically pleasing. How do you create a building that fits harmoniously into the existing urban fabric while also making a unique statement?
It's a delicate balance. You don't want the building to disappear into the background, but you also don't want it to clash with its surroundings. And then there's the challenge of designing buildings that foster a sense of community.
Absolutely. How do you create spaces that encourage interaction, a sense of belonging, and a connection to the city? These are questions that architects are constantly grappling with as they envision the future of New York City's architecture.
It's a fascinating exploration, and I'm already feeling inspired to look at the city with fresh eyes, to appreciate those design details, those architectural choices that shape our experience of New York City.
And I think that's one of the most rewarding aspects of exploring architecture. It makes you more aware of your surroundings, more appreciative of the thought and artistry that go into creating the spaces we inhabit.
It's like unlocking a secret language, understanding the stories the buildings tell and the impact they have on our lives. But I think we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've journeyed from those iconic bridges to the heart of Manhattan's grid and explored the trends shaping the future of this ever-evolving city.
We've certainly delved into some fascinating aspects of New York City's architecture. And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I think it's important to consider the human element of architecture, the way buildings shape our lives, reflect our values, and create those spaces where we connect, create, and thrive.
That sounds like the perfect segue into part three. I'm eager to explore that human connection to architecture and discover what other architectural treasures await us. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the fascinating world of NYC architecture. It's been an incredible journey so far, from those soaring skyscrapers to those intimate brownstone neighborhoods, and we've even explored the impact of bridges and the grid system and those quirky details that make this city's architecture so unique.
It's amazing how much we've uncovered, isn't it? We've touched on the evolution of styles, the influence of regulations, and even those technological advancements that made these architectural feats possible. But as we wrap up our exploration, I think it's essential to bring it back to the human element.
I love that idea. After all, architecture is ultimately about creating spaces for people, right? It's about designing environments that enhance our lives, inspire us, and shape our experiences.
Precisely. A well-designed building is more than just bricks and mortar. It's a living, breathing space that should cater to human needs and aspirations.
So it's not just about aesthetics, it's about functionality, accessibility, and creating spaces that work for diverse communities.
Exactly. Then think about the flow of people within a building, the availability of natural light, the creation of spaces that encourage interaction and a sense of belonging. These are all crucial considerations for architects.
You see this thoughtful approach in the design of public spaces like parks, libraries, and community centers, don't you? These are spaces that are meant to be inclusive and welcoming, inviting people to gather, learn, and connect.
Absolutely. These spaces are the heart of a community, providing opportunities for recreation, education, and social interaction. And you'll notice that architects are increasingly incorporating these principles into residential buildings as well.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not just about designing individual apartments, it's about creating a sense of community within those larger residential buildings.
Exactly. Think about communal spaces, rooftop gardens, shared amenities. These are all design elements that encourage residents to connect with their neighbors and foster a sense of belonging.
It's like weaving a sense of community into the very fabric of the building. That's especially important in a city as large and diverse as New York, where it's easy to feel lost in the crowd.
You're absolutely right. These shared spaces can help counteract that sense of anonymity and create a more human-centered urban experience. It's about making the city feel more like a home, rather than just a collection of buildings.
And that brings us to the question of preservation. We've talked about new developments and innovative designs, but how do we balance the need for progress with the desire to protect our architectural heritage? How do we decide which buildings are worth saving and which ones make way for the new?
It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but I think it starts with recognizing the value of older buildings, not just for their historical significance, but also for their contribution to the city's character and identity.
You know, those brownstones, those tenement buildings, even those quirky pre-war apartment buildings with their unique details, they all add to the charm and texture of the city.
They tell stories of the people who lived and worked here before us, and they connect us to the city's past. Losing those buildings would be like losing a part of the city's soul.
So how do we ensure that these architectural treasures are preserved for future generations? Is it simply about designating certain buildings as landmarks, or is there more to it?
Landmarking is certainly an important tool, but it's not the only solution. Sometimes preserving those buildings means finding new uses for them, adapting them to meet contemporary needs while respecting their historical character.
Oh, right. Like repurposing old factories into lofts, converting former schools into community centers, or even transforming those abandoned elevated railway lines into parks like the High Line.
Exactly. These projects breathe new life into older structures and create vibrant public spaces. It's about seeing the potential in these buildings and finding creative ways to make them relevant for today.
It's like a form of architectural recycling, giving those buildings a second chance to shine. And it's a reminder that preservation doesn't have to be about freezing a building in time. It can be about evolution and adaptation.
It's about finding that sweet spot where the past and the present coexist harmoniously. And that's a challenge that New York City, with its rich architectural tapestry, is constantly grappling with.
It's fascinating to think about how the city is constantly evolving, with new buildings rising alongside those architectural veterans that have witnessed centuries of change. It's a testament to the city's dynamic spirit, its resilience, and its enduring appeal.
And I think that's what makes exploring New York City's architecture so rewarding. It's a journey through time, a glimpse into the city's past, present, and future, all reflected in those bricks, beams, and glass facades.
It's like unlocking a secret code, understanding the language of architecture and the stories it tells. As we conclude our deep dive, what's one key takeaway you hope our listeners will remember about NYC architecture?
I'd say it's this. New York City's architecture is a reflection of the city itself, dynamic, diverse, ever-evolving, and a testament to human ingenuity and creativity.
It's a reminder that architecture is more than just buildings. It's about the people who inhabit them, the lives they live, the stories they create, and the connections they forge within those spaces.
So the next time you're walking through the city, take a moment to look up, observe the details, appreciate the artistry, and consider how those architectural choices shape your experience of New York City.
And don't forget to imagine what those future skylines might look like. Considering how much New York's architecture has already changed, what do you think the city will look like in another 100 years?
There's a whole world of architectural possibilities out there waiting to be discovered. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep imagining the possibilities.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the captivating world of NYC architecture. Until next time, keep those eyes peeled and those minds open.